I was curious to see what you were going to use. Thanks, John. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay? That sound good? All right, awesome. Thanks for coming tonight. That's really nice. Take your Tuesday night, come out. It's great. I see old friends, new friends. Really, really good to have you here. And yes, John was kind enough to invite me. And yes, we do have these talks about how the Baroque is too old. And, so it's really, really good to be able to share this. And for me, it was just one of these things where, because people always ask me, well, how'd you find this topic, right? I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota, and my dad had gone to St. John's for a year back in the 50s, actually right when they started construction of the church. And then my sister had gone to leadership camp up there, and so it was like dropping her off. But the building was there, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, right? But Wendy's gone for a whole week, woohoo! And it just kind of always hung in my mind, though. And when it came time to finding a dissertation topic when I was in grad school at the University of Virginia, I went, whoa, wait a minute. So I'm out in Virginia, and I'm thinking, well, the family's back in the Midwest, and it'd be nice, and it's a really important building because I've been living on the East Coast and going to school there, and Breuer has done a lot of work in New York and Washington, D.C., right? And people there just didn't know about this place, didn't know about St. John's. And at St. John's, we have the largest collection of Breuer buildings in the whole world, on one site of different building types. So it's kind of this fascinating ability to study a master architect's work really closely. And then for me, kind of morphed right back to that church almost immediately. I had written my master's thesis on a 19th century monastery by an English architect named Pugin. And they were Trappists, and I got to live with them for a couple of weeks, and they really opened their doors to me, which was great. And I really got interested in what monastic space was like. And so then when it came to thinking about the Benedictines and St. John's and coming back to Minnesota and all of that, I thought, well, that's it, right? And so I've been working on this project for a long time, over a decade. Don't recommend this for approaches. Get it done, move it out, use your sabbatical wisely, stuff like that. But it's given me, I think, a chance to really understand this place in a way that I'm very fortunate to be able to do so. And they've been really kind to me. It's been a wonderful year rolling this out. So I'm glad to share it with my friends at St. Thomas. And by the way, they all know that I'm here tonight speaking. It's the other Catholic school. The jokes are so easy and, all far between and in between. And but they really, there's one thing I have found in working on this project even though there's always a little kidding about St. Thomas when I go up there or whatever, and I've been giving talks for alumni all across the country, there's still a great respect between these two programs, these two schools, and I'm really happy about that. So let me tell you a story then. Let me tell you about Marcel Breuer, New York City architect, the Benedictines up in Collegeville, and this church that they built. And the whole book is centered around this notion that great architecture can only be produced when you have a client and an architect who work well together, who want to create something special, who see a bigger vision, who work together. And it's not that they get along wonderfully all the time. No, absolutely not. But it's that they have a common goal and they work really hard to get to that goal. And here it was about a group of monks who, after World War II, were, St. John's was the largest abbey in the whole world, the largest Benedictine abbey in the whole world. And these monks had taken on the role of leaders in liturgical reform in the whole world. And all of a sudden, they're out of space. And so instead of thinking about just kind of adding on in a piecemeal fashion, they decide that they want to do something really special. And the person who designs that for them should be an architect of great repute. And so they go after these people. But it's a story about guys like Abbot Baldwin Dvorak right here. And then, of course, the whole chapter up there. Marcel Breuer seated right here. This is Hamilton Smith, his lead associate on the project. And this constant dialogue, and one thing that monastics do really well, and particularly the Benedictines, is they keep excellent records. So I've had so much paperwork to look at, which has been really, really fun to be able to see these little things. And then even to find notes, little handwritten notes about things that happened at meetings that some monk was able, to leave behind and got picked up and put in a file. I mean, it's just been a fascinating process of research. It started out with a need to come to America, though. I mean, they settled in this region in the 19th century. This is St. John's, kind of right around the turn of the 20th century. And so imagine, you guys mostly from Minnesota, how many people have been to St. John's? Let me see that. Okay, good. Do most of you know of it? But we're in Minnesota, right? So this is, Stearns County, 1900. Not exactly a hot spot of Minnesota. It's kind of, the country. I grew up in the country, so I feel very good saying that. But it's, think about that. Think about that unified monastic complex just being out there in the hills of Stearns County, kind of the rolling hills of Stearns County. This really powerful vision. And from the get-go, they were trying to use architecture to communicate effectively to people who were there. Of course, architecture always tries to do that, but here it's particularly more so engaged. The monks who settled this place came over from Bavaria, an abbey of Metten, which is still there, and Baroque, John, right there, it's okay. A little bit later, I know, they added on. But they left there, and led by a guy named Boniface Wimmer. I stopped in New York. New York wouldn't take them in, and they kept moving to Pennsylvania, where Wimmer settled down and created the Abbey of St. Vincent. And St. Vincent's is still there and thriving today. And this was really important because it's all about, moving the faith over here. It's about monastics moving over, but it's also about supporting all the immigrants, the Catholic immigrants who are coming to this part of the world, and showcasing this kind of connectivity that you can have through architecture. There's also financial support as well. So Wimmer sends 6 of his monks to come to Minnesota, following the path of these immigrants. They come to St. Paul first and have a little meeting with Cretin, Archbishop Cretin, and eventually work their way up the Mississippi River, just outside St. Cloud, where they do some wooden structures, and then realize that that's not going to be exactly where they want to be because they need natural materials, right? They need wood, and they need animals and water and all these things. And they're determined to find that land, so they do. And what is the present site of Collegeville right now? Find thousands of acres that they can come and settle down their first buildings on. So this is actually a little part of the wooden chapel that comes from this original site outside St. Cloud. But then they start creating architecture to support what's going on. So they are educators. They are educating at different levels, like high school to college level. They're a monastery as well. So they're kind of a need for a lot of different things here. But these first buildings are really pretty just practical. That you would have an old stone house, the first thing that's built here, that would have a bunch of different functions in it. It would have a refectory, dormitory, chapel, and everything keeps shifting as they keep adding buildings. So eventually they put on things like this brick building. You can see the first church being constructed here at this point, but starting to pull these things together to create this presence on the plains. This is the guy, though, who really unifies and creates that vision of that bulky monastery in the 1900s that I showed you early on, Abbot Edelbrock. And this is the thing. I mean, you've got to have the most successful architecture, like I said, will have a really determined patron client. They've got to have a vision. They've got to make people believe. They've got to get the money, right? These are all things that happen to these processes where you have this success. So he heads over to Green Bay to visit this guy because he's building a new cathedral in Green Bay, and this is it right here. Kraupauer had hired an architect, and they'd done these drawings and created this building. And Kraupauer, like Edelbrock and other people, were getting money from King Ludwig I in Bavaria, who is the connector, the royal connector of this all. You know, there's a disillusion of the monasteries, of course, in the Renaissance Baroque time frame in Germany. And actually King Ludwig I, so he's the dad of Mad King Ludwig, who does Neuschwanstein, which you might have heard about. He is the one who restores a lot of monasteries. Like he brings 26 monasteries back to life in Germany in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. So really, really crucial. But as is, you know, his citizens are leaving to come live in America, he wants to solidify the reputation. So they will provide money to people. And then the other thing going on is that they'll provide architectural sources. So this right here is Ludwig's church on the Ludwigstrasse in Munich. If you've ever been there, Ludwig was trying to recreate this kind of magical Greece, Rome, Italian Renaissance life there. There's palazzos, there's triumphal arch. I mean, he's got the whole thing. But his church was this. And, you know, it's kind of this modified early Christian, Romanesque thing. But those towers and that sensibility of that building translate right into something like this, Assumption Church, right in downtown St. Paul. And the other thing is Assumption Church was designed by King Ludwig I's court architect, Edward Riedel. So direct connections. And guess what else? The St. John's monks ran Assumption for a while about this time too. So it all goes together. Then, go back. This is the drawing for Green Bay. For Green Bay. Notice the towers didn't get done at Green Bay. They put something else on later. See this? St. John's first church, right? Yes, yes, you're thinking exactly the right thing, exactly the right thing. That's the drawing that Abbot Edelbrock brings back with him, and then they use it to build St. John's. And when you hold up this drawing to this completed building, you see there's just a couple of differences. There's this extra inset of this layer in the tower here. Some of the corbelling right in here gets a little offset, shall we say, during the build. But really, by and large, it's the same building. And so it's, you know, helpful to have a good building model. It's also purposeful because this will draw comparisons to each other, to relationships between Green Bay, between St. Paul, between Collegeville. The interior of the first Abbey Church looked like this. You would buy things from studio catalogs. Like a lot of studio artisans were in Chicago, Milwaukee Catholic catalogs that would sell altars, paintings, all sorts of furniture that you would need, windows even. I mean, you could purchase this stuff and it would come, and most of the stuff in the building, the first building, is purchased like that. There's not really a ton of artists or designers in here working. It's putting it together. This altar is pressed way back up in the apse there. This is important because this is going to be liturgical reform and then the next church. And so you can see that here. There's a screen here. The monks were sitting in the transepts, which are off to the side here. And then later in 1909, there was a renovation, so it kind of cleaned it up a little bit, brought in this. And Maria, isn't this the one that's in St. Michael that was in storage, and then did it end up in St. Michael? I can't remember. I know. Maria and I worked on a project together. Well, she did it. I watched her, which is great. But I think that's the one. So there was this baldachin that's over the altar here. I think eventually went into storage somewhere and ended up someplace else. I mean, this is pretty common. You know, when people build new churches, they will try to draw upon things. In fact, like your chapel, right, over in Sitzman Hall is windows from Boston. Is that right? Yeah, exactly. So that's really practical. But you can see it got cleaned up a little bit. The altar has been pulled out a little bit from the wall. And this is right before they start to work on the new building. So this is actually Abbot Baldwin Dvorak, who is Baldwin, the builder of the new Breuer church, the patron, really. This is a mass that he is celebrating. And so you can see the scale of this And back here, you might notice too, these paintings, these were done in the 30s by some monks who came over from Breuer Abbey and do this kind of Nazarene, really stylized religious painting. That's still there in situ. And of course, now if you've been to St. John's, you know this is the Great Hall, right? And the only thing that's there decoratively really is this art in the apse, and they whitewashed it and they use it for events and things like that. So here's a little video clip of that Mass. No sound, I apologize. But this is Baldwin's over here. And so this is in the old church. This is in the old church. And the quality is really bad. But this, for me, was one of my great archival finds. So I'm up at St. John's. So the book came out in October. So it was it was 2 summers ago this coming summer. And I'm talking with a guy named Father Hilary Timish, who used to be president of St. John's. And he was the youngest member of the church building committee when Breuer built the church. So he was in his 20s. And he's still there, and he still is a dorm master and all these things, and really knows this whole thing so well. So I was sitting down with him, and I really wanted to get a picture of Breuer in the building at the dedication masses. And I knew that he was there. I mean, I know exactly where he was. I hadn't found it in any pictures, and I thought, huh. And I don't know why. I kept thinking there was a movie. I mean, it's 1961, right? There could be a movie. There could be a movie. And so I said to Hilary, I said, do you think there was a movie? I mean, is there any way? He goes, no. And then he goes and has dinner, right? He go to evening prayer. He has dinner. I get this call in the guest house, and you never get calls from the monks in the guest house. All of a sudden, the phone's ringing. I'm like, he goes, I talked to the abbot at dinner. We think there's a movie. So it's Hilary, right? I'm like, okay, there's a movie. So then I call my archivist, who has been my friend for over a decade now, and I never call him at night either, right? And he goes, everything okay? I'm like, yeah. They think there's a movie. He goes, you were talking to Hilary and the abbot about this, weren't you? I'm like, yes, I was. And so there's a movie. So by the time I get down into the archive before 8 o'clock the next morning, he says to me, and listen, people, I've been in this archive for a decade working with them. I mean, I've organized parts of it, right? And all of a sudden, he takes me over to this closet, and he goes, and it's open. There's no doors on it anymore, but I'd never had access to it. He goes, why don't you take a look? And so it's old tape recorders and, reel-to-reel tape and old slide boxes, and it's all dusty. But stuck in the back corner are like 4 of those 16-millimeter film strip reels, right? Like social studies in high school. And there is dedication masses. It was awesome. But they don't have any sound. So that was a downside. But the thing that's really fascinating about them is we sat and watched them up there. And my good friends in IRT here at St. Thomas actually put these digitally for us, and then we shared them with them, is that we see a lot of different versions of how the priests are celebrating Mass. There were 3 dedication masses during the 4-day period that this church was consecrated. The consecration Mass itself was broken into 2 parts, a night and then the next day. And then there was a parish Mass, and then there was a Mass where they trucked all the nuns in from all across the upper Midwest. Like the church is just full of nuns in habit. It's really amazing. Anyway, we see that they're celebrating one time when the bishop of St. Cloud is doing the thing. He celebrates with his back to the people. But then during the regular parish Mass, then the priests face the people. So I think theologically there's a lot to be explored from these yet. But this was one of these moments where you scream out loud and see what can happen, and it was very fun. So too much. But so the other thing I have to tell you about is liturgical reform at St. John's. So in the 19th century, there had been this start, and probably a lot of you know this better than I do, of a need to reform the liturgy, to kind of get away from some of the things that had happened over the centuries and make the liturgy more participatory, to bring back a focus on the sacraments, to start thinking about saying the Mass in the vernacular rather than in Latin, to draw some of these things in that would make it more accessible to people. And then this really keeps ramping up until we're moving forward toward Vatican II, which Vatican II starts in 1962, but there's a lot of preparations obviously before that. And a number of the monks at St. John's are expert advisors to the Second Vatican Council, one in particular, Father Godfrey Diekmann. So as this is all going forward, there are some other things with the faith that need to be thought about. St. John's, by 1950, when they start thinking about adding on, is the largest Benedictine abbey in the world. They're home to over 300 brethren, and about 130 of them are priests. And at this point, concelebration is not allowed. So all the priests have to say Mass individually every day, right? And a lot of them are traveling or doing missionary work, that sort of thing. But the basement of the First Abbey Church with its, little altarpieces and Reredas bought from Mish Studios down in Chicago or something, is rapid fire, right? Because everybody's trying to get their Mass in. And my dad told me that there was actually a call button system for the freshmen living up in the dorms, up on the 4th floor of the quadrangle, to come down and serve Mass. And, they just had to have this whole system in place. And so what they did is all these altars, and look, this is just plumbing pipe with curtain, and there you go. Every day, a priest has to say Mass. Takes a lot of time. So that was something that gets itself worked out in the new church, but not really soon enough. So we'll talk more about that in a second. But there's just a need for space. There's just a need for space. So here's what we look like before Breuer and team comes in. Here's the quadrangle, the original monastery. So 1920s, 30s infill here. And even Barnes here yet, right? So this is the guy. Abbot Baldwin Dvorak is the one who takes this charge upon the whole chapter, really, to create this new place, to give them more space for the aged and infirmed fathers and brothers, more classroom space, more library space, a bigger worshiping facility, church, dorm space, everything. They are just tapped out. The numbers are big. The church should hold 1,200 people. 1,200 people. So a building committee is put together. Claude Meinberg, right here, was teaching in the art department. He actually had an architecture degree from Illinois, but never became an architect. And so he was given the task, along with a guy named Frank Kazmarczyk, liturgical coordinator who has done a lot of work here in the cities too, to create a list of architects that would be considered for this project. And it's kind of different than a typical architectural competition. The architects were invited, and that can happen, but they were not asked to bring any designs with them to their interview. The Benedictines were looking for somebody they could work with for a long time, because when you're doing a campus master plan kind of thing, it's not just like 3 or 4 years in with a church and out, right? This is decades we're talking about. And then they're also thinking about, who would be the right person for this? Do we want someone who does sacred space only? Does it need to be a Catholic architect? Or does it need to be somebody who's maybe really good at city planning? So trying to figure this all out, Baldwin knew that he wasn't, connected to this world of art and architecture in the ways that Cloud and Frank were. So he really draws upon people who have expertise. And this guy right here, Watrin, Meinberg, Watrin there. He actually was teaching some architecture classes. St. John's for a while had a little school of architecture, or a little program in architecture, I should say, that they were running out of their math department. So they had some awareness of things, that's for sure. In fact, they thought for a while that they could do it themselves, and Father Watrin drew up this plan for a new church. So right here is the old church. And then the new one is going to be bigger, but just flop off of that western end. So that, was a good try, but they realized pretty quickly that this thing is just too big. So let's see what we can do. So they invite 12 architects. They get a list down to 12. 5 of them are European, 7 of them are American. These architects right here, these 4, Schwartz, Bauer, Kremreiter, and Boslett, were really masterful church builders in Europe in the years after World War I, before World War I too, but starting to bring in the new liturgy, this kind of open space with an altar that would be centralized and focused between the community and the laity, or between the laity, and the celebrant. And someone like Boslett had actually done a Benedictine abbey. So they were on the list. This guy right here, Thomas Sharp, was English, and he was a city planner. He had put together some cities after World War II, like Exeter and Durham, by inserting pretty banal modern architecture, but, and still today, he's the one guy on the list that just appears. And nobody, I talked to Frank a long time before he passed and things like that. We just can't figure out where he came from. So, but he was there. So, problem, this is, pre-internet, right? Pre-FedEx, pre-anything, well, I guess you make a phone call, but they wanted to send out a letter. They want to send out the letter at the same time. So a letter going to Austria or Switzerland or Germany is getting there a lot later than something going to New York, right? Or St. Louis or wherever it might be. So these 5 Europeans never really had a chance at this thing, because by the time some of them even write back, some of the people who were the finalists visited campus. So it was a timing thing. Plus they didn't know how they were going to get them there. Financially that's a task to bring in somebody like that. So these two guys, Errol Saarinen, designed the St. Louis Arch, TWA Airport in New York, Washington Dulles Airport. He and his dad, Eliel, did Christ Church Lutheran across the river here in South Minneapolis, a wonderful little mid-century church. Saarinen was one of the busiest architects in the country at this point and had done some large-scale planning like the General Motors Tech Center in Detroit. So he was on the list. He said, I'm too busy. I can't do it. The other guy, Pietro Beluschi, was running his own practice and the head of the architecture school at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he had also done a lot of churches, a lot of Lutheran churches out on the West Coast. He was from Portland, did a beautiful little priory in Rhode Island, Portsmouth. And he was also too busy. But you know, they both said, this is an amazing project. You know, if we weren't just completely overwhelmed, we would be all in on this. So then 5 architects visited campus. The first to come was this guy, Richard Neutra. And you probably haven't heard of Richard Neutra before. Not a household name. You maybe heard of Frank Lloyd Wright. Yeah? Frank Lloyd Wright? Yep. So Neutra, though, was on Time magazine. And by most people I talked to who are from that time and really kind of study this period, Neutra was second to Wright in popularity in architecture. Like he was the #2 architect in the whole world for a lot of reasons. So he was pretty popular then. And he had done this modern house. He'd come over from Vienna and worked his way across the country, working for Frank Lloyd Wright for a little bit, actually, before settling in California. And Richard came with his son, Dion, because Richard had some heart problems. And at the Abbey, what they would do is they would walk around and look at things. They weren't presenting any designs. They weren't supposed to. They were just supposed to think about how the monks were using the space and where they were going and what the buildings could be and what the site looked like, and talk to the monks. But the reports that the monks wrote, you know, afterwards are really so fascinating, and then talking to them. I guess Neutra just, you know, happened to have a copy of the Time magazine cover with him at all times, and it was on the table at every meeting, so there's that, right? And then he would also kind of run around quoting the Rule of Benedict and St. Benedict in Latin, you know, to showcase that little moment as well. And some monks were a little offended by that. So his visit was pretty, he wasn't going to get the job, let's just say that. But for me as an architectural historian, somebody like Richard Neutra, and then this guy, Walter Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus, the great change in design in the 20th century where modernism started to take over in architecture, and Gropius founded that in Germany. When I see these two names together, and then when I learned, when I'm up in going through the papers, that Neutra's visit was the day before Gropius, and Gropius arrived at St. John's that night, and Neutra and Gropius had breakfast together. I mean, I still get goosebumps every time I say that. I just got them. So it's for me like, holy cow, are you kidding me? Where did this happen? You know, so I know where it happened. But wow, can you believe that? I mean, these two men were in this sacred place talking about things together over breakfast. And I have no idea what they said to each other. Nobody does. But that's so fascinating to me. Now, the thing about Neutra was his health was bad and he was older. And this may seem kind of like, well, why is that a consideration? Well, it is when you're building for 15, 20, 30 years. And they talk about this. So they talk about age, they talk about religion, they talk about an ability to be somebody they want to hang out with. You know, somebody who's going to listen to them, somebody who's going to respect what they're doing. It's very clear. And that's why they don't ask for architectural drawings, because that's not what they're interested in. They're going to get to the architecture. But in the meantime, they've got to have the right person to get there. So Gropius is in his 70s. And Gropius was Marcel Breuer's teacher for a while. And then they became good friends. They were both at the Bauhaus at the same time. They go to London together to get away from Nazi persecution. They end up in Harvard together at the Graduate School of Design, teaching there. They live by each other outside of Boston in Lincoln, Mass. I mean, they had been friends for a really long time. And Gropius shows them this building when they ask him to see something. So he has a good visit. But he tells them, Marcel Breuer's your guy. He says, Breuer's the guy. So then there are some of the monks who think that their architect should be Catholic, could only be Catholic. And so they invite this guy, Joseph Dennis Murphy of St. Louis, to come to the Abbey. Murphy was working with another guy, Eugene Mackey, down in St. Louis, doing a lot of churches for the archdiocese there. He's also the head of the architecture school at Washington University, so building a lot of projects. And thankfully right now there's a new friend of mine who's writing her dissertation on Murphy, so this is great news. But he showed them designs for this church in a suburb of St. Louis, And when they saw it completed, and then just, it's kind of hard to read here, but this window is this, and this is by M.L. Fry, who's one of the great mid-century stained glass artists. But when they saw this, when the monks saw that interior, they went, ah, that wasn't quite as exciting as I expected it to be or hoped it to be. Because the one thing they talked about continuously was that the architecture they build should showcase engineering principles in design. And in doing so, they said it should be modern. In fact, in this letter, they said to all these architects, we believe that the modern architect with his orientation toward functionalism is the person who can create a truly great Catholic work at this point in time. So what they're saying, though, is always couched, and don't think this is a straight up modern thing. I mean, visually, absolutely, right? But they always couch it in, you know, when our medieval counterparts built the Gothic cathedrals, that was new. That was engineered architecture that revealed itself in a completely different way. And so we think we're like Abbé Suger of Saint-Denis or Lanfranc. You know, we are creating in that same vein this new architecture that can be appropriate for the Catholic Church. So Murphy didn't make the cut. Breuer comes in next. And they knew Breuer's work from this house, which was built in the Museum of Modern Art's garden, kind of an attempt to make a middle-class house, prefabricated, sort of. It was a little too expensive and never took off. And then that House and Home issue magazine is something that they talk about directly as knowing his work. And Breuer had been doing mostly domestic structures up to this point. He had done some larger scale planning, one in particular that's really important. But they loved this. They really loved this about it. And his visit was good, you know, and the one little piece of notepaper I found, I'm actually late in the process. There was a little piece of scratch paper in a box that some monk had written on the back of like another note. He didn't say anything until the end of the day. That was huge because he went around with them all day. He listened to them. He watched things. He soaked everything in, and then he began to ask some questions. Breuer was from Hungary originally. He was actually born a Jew, but renounced his Judaism as the Nazis started to rise. Came to America eventually from Germany to England and so on, and then lived in Massachusetts before moving to New York, where he ran his practice where he was at this point, and then eventually passing away in New York City. And then the other guy was a noted Catholic architect, Brer, who had done a lot of work in Chicago and other places, but for example, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Byrne had done another church in Chicago that looked pretty much like this, where you're starting to push that altar out into the church, and Cardinal Mundelein didn't like it and kind of kicked him out for a while. So he ends up in Tulsa and Cork and Atchison, Kansas, I mean, all these other places. But the thing about Byrne is that he was really well connected with a group called the Liturgical Art Society, which was based out in New York, led by a guy named Maurice Laveneau, and they were promoting good design in art and architecture for the liturgy. And he published plans in there and drawings and things, and so he kind of knew all the right people. And he comes up and tells them, Marcel Breuer is your guy. So Gropius has been in, Byrne's been in, and Breuer has made a huge hit. So they hire Marcel Breuer and his team, send him a telegram, say this, and then Breuer writes back this lovely letter. And they come to the Abbey. So this happens in 53. Right in the beginning of 54, they come and present their first plans for St. John's. So one thing they had to do was figure out what this worship space was going to be. And they had to really think through this plan and how it could facilitate a more ecumenical nature within itself. So this is a larger worksheet, and I know you can't read this, so don't worry about it. But what I want you to look at are just some of these drawings. So this is a drawing of the old church, where the monks had been in the choir in these transepts. And then this is an English church here. And then look at, there's a triangle and things. So let me show you a detail here. What they're trying to do, this is Hamilton Smith and a guy named Bob Gatchie, who were working in Breuer's office and were kind of two of the leads on this project. What they're trying to do is figure out where the altar is going to go, because it can't be tucked up against that back wall anymore. It's got to come out and be visible and accessible to people. So this notation is actually Breuer's here. Too far from the two groups too far apart, also too isolated from the congregation. The English plan, that's not going to work because there's a big screen there and the altar's way up there, no good. Then they kind of even mess around with the square that's kind of recessed down, that's not going to work. The altar didn't even make it into that one. But here, they're starting to get at something. So they put the altar back here, choir stalls for the monks, and then the laity stalls. And keep in mind, it's a little bit more of a complicated church program because you have the monastic choir stalls in there, right? But eventually they say, oh, okay, maybe we're getting there. This, he says here, though, too far from congregation. What he wants to see is this altar come up between the two areas, like this. And then that is eventually going to morph into the shape of a trapezoid. Now, the trapezoid, in Breuer's architectural lexicon, was something he'd been using for a long time for large gathering spaces, like this theater that was part of a concrete city plan back in the 30s. And then also, just as this thing's rolling, he's designing the new UNESCO headquarters outside of Paris. And this big space right here, I mean, when you look at this and you know St. John's, it's, yes, they're really tied to each other. But so the trapezoid, though, in sacred space, really hadn't had much use. But for Breuer, it was really easy to bring a lot of people together in that space. So here they are presenting some drawings. They put all these boards up there. We have all these boards, which is really great. You can see the first church design there. There's Breuer and Baldwin. And there's the first model. So it's a campus. It's a campus. They had told the architects, look, you can win the campus master plan competition, but you may not design any buildings in it. Well, bad idea. By the way, did you know we're doing a campus master plan here too at St. Thomas right now? As part of the new strategic plan, there's a campus master plan committee that I happen to be on that's reconsidering things going on here. We're not looking to expand, just looking to reevaluate. So we just put out a call for architects last week, and by the Tuesday after Easter, we will have a list of people we're bringing to Campus Standard Review. So the same kind of thing is going on right now right here, which is really fun, for me anyway. But there's the church. The monastic area would be back here. This would be new public space for the school. So there's this kind of public quadrangle, and then this would be the more private space. And Breuer was going to do a thing called shadow building. So when the new library got done, he was going to tear the old one down. But a lot of buildings stayed just because the cost on that would have been too crazy to try to do this all at once. Here's the 1953, late 1953 design for the first Abbey Church of St. John's. This model still exists. It's up at St. John's. This exterior model was done by Breuer's office. This interior model was done by Father Claude Meinberg and some of his students to show what the interior drawing that Breuer's office created would have looked like. Look at that thing. Gilt ceiling, white painted sidewalls, blue in the back on that concrete behind this very figural screen above the altar. Completely different sensibility than what is finished. But reasons for that will become apparent. Then there's this new form, this bell banner, right? This thing that Breuer likened to a classical arcade or a Gothic arch. This new form that he said was made possible by engineering techniques, by the contemporary day engineering techniques. So reinforced concrete, hyperbolic paraboloids. And so his earliest drawings show this kind of singular support with a crazy relationship to the building itself. Here's a singular support, and kind of working through these. Notice here how you get to these double supports on either side. That's a transition that happens because of his time in Paris working on UNESCO, where he goes by the Eiffel Tower every day to work. So think about the Eiffel Tower with that splay, right? You know, and it just makes more sense because what he's doing then is he's got that banner, that transitional element from the profane to the sacred world. Then the baptistry is the next in plan because we're putting the sacraments back in the line of importance. We're not putting the baptistry, you know, tucked off in a corner that you can't see. And then we're moving into the church. So how are those elements going to relate to each other is what he's trying to figure out. Now the bell wall existed in sacred space, in the Greek islands where Breuer went sailing a lot, the American Southwest where he traveled a lot. This is a church from the American Southwest. And then this is a piece, this is something I found in the archives at Syracuse University where a lot of his papers are. And it's actually an advertisement for the car down here, but it's a bell wall, right? And on the back in Breuer's hand is like the bell wall at St. John's, right? So there's this direct connection here to all of this. So those are really fun moments. And this baptistry, which was going to be on this spiritual axis, originally looked a lot like his domestic interiors, this kind of screened off nature on the same level, smaller baptistry. That's going to change too. What happens is, so if these are presented in 54, the monks don't have any money to build the church. They've been working on the dorm, that's important. They've been getting a couple other things going, another student dorm. But the church is going to cost, and its finished date, $2 million. So you can, do the inflation calculator up till today. It's a lot. And they just can't get it going financially. So some things happen. McGough Construction, local construction company, which actually won the first bid on this project, they come back and rebid. And so in 56, they rebid. Some of the prices of materials have gone down, and they've been raising money. So there's a redesign that goes on. And this is part of it. So this is the 1957 model. And unfortunately, this is no longer in existence. It went from St. John's out to New York to be on a TV show with Breuer and never came back, unfortunately. But this one we still have, but you can see the difference. So in this original facade here, that grid is almost like a Piet Mondrian painting, those rectilinear nature, right? Structurally, that would have been impossible to build because it's this huge wall, 180 feet that needs some structure to hold everything in place there. So, and I found out at a talk I gave in New York when Bob Gatchie was there, and it's something that had never come up in our conversations before, that he is the one who actually designed this. Breuer just asked him to put something together quick, and he just picked that. It was pretty much that simple. That was his little moment. But then what happened in the interim is that this department store in the Netherlands, De Bijenkorf, which means beehive, Breuer takes these these travertine hexagons, and they become the facades of this building. And then eventually they decide that maybe the hexagon could work at St. John's too. The banner also shifts a little bit. Breuer, according to Isabel Hyman, who wrote this masterful book on his whole work, and she was one of my professors at New York University, she said that Breuer really would have loved to have been a sculptor if he could have made a living that way. And when you look at these bell banner designs, you get this sense of architecture as sculpture, of cutting away of these solids, these voids. He talks a lot about sun and shadow and solids and voids in his writing with his architecture. And I think that his love of working in concrete is directly tied to his desire to have architecture be as sculptural as it possibly could. So this one's almost kind of menacing, right? But what we eventually get to is this down here. I mean, and there's so much discussion back and forth, like should the cross be a positive or a negative element in the element, in the structure as well. So just this constant little dialogue between these two. The back and forth is amazing on this project. And then, just in case, you have a child who might be interested in Marcel Breuer's architecture, which even though I have a 9-year-old, he's not interested in Marcel Breuer's architecture, but what can I do? He likes this other guy, Frank Gehry, but that's a whole different story. This is a coloring book that the office did, and a couple of the pages are here. This is the bell banner cutouts. So you can cut that out, make your own little bell banner. And then this says, they are thinking of building this in the middle of Paris, color it in weathered steel. So you can have a little fun with these moments too. This is now preserved at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And I found out too, just a little bit ago, that this was just something they did for fun, at holidays one year. And in the 70s when Breuer was starting to be of more ill health and wanted the office clean out a little bit, so he just said to associate, clean out that file cabinet, take whatever you want, throw everything else out, blah, blah, blah. And so one of the associates took this, and so we have it today. So it's these kind of little moments that can happen too. So here we are, building St. John's finally with McGough. There's Mr. McGough right there. This guy right here, Val Michelson, is the local on-site architect who came out of Breuer's office. He was fascinating. He had worked for a Jewish architect named Percival Goodman doing a lot of synagogues, but before that, he had worked in Russia and actually Estonia, building factories and things like that. And he gets separated from his wife during the Second World War, and she ends up in a concentration camp with their son, but he thinks they've died, and like 20, 30 years later, they reunite here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Only he's been remarried. I mean, it's like this crazy story. Val passed away a few years ago now. Ted Hoffmeyer was the site construction guy for McGough, and he had seen that picture of the 57 model in a magazine ad for concrete, and he called up McGough and said, I have to build this building for you. And he's fascinating too. He was building factories with Albert Kahn in Siberia and places like that in the 20s and 30s. So just these amazing people came together on this project. There's Breuer, Ham Smith, it's one of the engineers here, Wiesenfeld. Construction images just to show you this process, because Hoffmeyer took slides and photos every day on the site. He kept a logbook. I mean, it's really great. And a lot of these slides, just color-wise, weren't reproduced for the book at all. So there you see the steel frame here? So this is all poured in place concrete, right? So they are hauling in railroad car after railroad car of lumber from the West Coast to basically build a church out of wood that they're going to pour concrete into eventually, and then it's all going to go away. But to support the wooden formwork up on the top and some of the side too, you had to have this like little steel frame in it, so it looks like a little building kind of in and of itself. There's the side walls. This is the bell banner opening, getting ready for a pour. Here we go, 59. The walls are poured in place on the side, and the top was sprayed on in a material known as gunite, which is just basically sprayed on concrete. This is up on top of the roof. A lantern was a late addition to this building, but came in after some discussion with a local liturgical artist, actually, Adi Bethune, whose papers are over at St. Kate's. And there's that gunite being sprayed on. So look at all the reinforcing bar in there. I mean, just a really lot of work. And there were monks working on the job every day, and they were keeping track of how many hours the monks were working every day. They were tying rebar. They were bush hammering concrete, which basically means you get your concrete pour, and if you want the aggregate to show through, you give somebody a hammer, and they pound away at it so you can get, you know, this rough cast. And so that's probably a penance thing, I would think, right? Then covering the material, or covering the exterior with Cold Spring granite. Cold Spring, really close to here, great granite, really beautiful stuff. Didn't hurt that the head of Cold Spring granite sat on the St. John's board. That worked out well too, but really a lovely material. And then the steeples have to come off of the other church as we're getting close on the new church. So just all these kind of really fascinating moments of discussion. But what this is a sacred space. And one thing I wanted to really have come through in the book was that notion. You know, I'm an architectural historian, but it's really about buildings and the way we have to use them and what their use is all about. And so Father Claude Meinberg had written this essay on the monastic church. And so I was reading that essay, and he kept talking about an axis, and I thought, oh, the spiritual axis, right? This line that moves from the front of the building in all the way up to the abbot's throne in this particular instance, that comes in under that banner, through the baptistry, then in through the church here where there are confessionals on either side of the doorway, the nave, altar, and then ending at the abbot's throne because it's a monastic church. And for me, that became a really interesting way to think about it, as kind of this public engagement with the spiritual. And then the other thing I work on with this building is the more personal moments you can have with elements of this building. So let me show you. The banner, we've talked about, poured in place concrete. Those supports of the legs go down about 15 feet, and then they connect down underneath with a big pad of concrete. And another thing I found out during the talks in the last couple months is that the first pad of concrete that McGough poured actually broke apart, and they had to go in and re-pour it. But that's because they want this thing to be stable, right? The local bishop of St. Cloud, let's just say, was not a big fan of this building. And he, you know, told them, oh, that thing's coming down. You know, the first thing to go at St. John's is going to be the bell banner. But because of that construction there, that thing is held and been really sound. Then moving through into the baptistry, here, coming in the doors, baptistry like in the early Christian church, into the water and back out, very purposeful, lots of essays and dialogue back and forth between the architect's office and the monks about this. This is a baptismal font that was hewn out of one solid chunk of granite from Cold Spring by one workman for about 18 days, designed by Breuer, so again, his ability to do sculpture. And then tucked over here in the shadows is this figure of St. John the Baptist by an American artist named Doris Cesar, who was from the East Coast. And Breuer actually knew her a little bit and would design a house, a little cottage for her and her husband after this project was done. Then the space is compressed here yet. And then you start to move through into the nave. So you can see some of the light ahead. These doors here have copper insets in the wood. And you get up, though, to that altar. It's about getting to that altar. And this is part of the consecration mass. The marble is Vermont white marble here. It's the only non-Cold Spring marble in the building because Breuer and the monks wanted white marble. They wanted the altar to be as powerful visually as it possibly could. And then there's all sorts of discussions about things like how high should the predella or that little raised area platform, how high should that be so we can get the altar up? And just this kind of constant back and forth. How big should it be? At first it starts out completely square and then it kind of changes. So that all is part of the discussion and gets this focal point. And then these communion tables around it, this ambo here, and then up to the abbot's throne. The baldachin was also kind of a later addition, and that's completely made out of wood. And then here's a look at, again, part of this dedication going on in here. Crucifix here actually turns, so depending on how you want Mass, you can turn that so the corpus will face the right way. And then this engagement, 1,200 people can sit in this building. There's also a balcony we've come in underneath. 1,200 people can be in this building with no one person more than 85 feet from the altar. So trying to pull this all together, and it's a building now that doesn't have the same use, right? Because these monastic communities just are not as big in number. So you could have 300 brethren in here and pretty much fill up the choir stalls. And now, I don't know, I think we're around 100 up there. And the big events, though, are things that have to do with the university, like graduation, and then also the high feast days are also really popular here. A more private element in the church is the Lady Chapel. And in the Lady Chapel, you get a sense of what the rest of the building might have looked like had, they colored it. But when Breuer saw the formwork come off, when he saw the wooden formwork come off the concrete pours, he said, hold it, that's it. This is engineered architecture. I can see it. It's like the medieval cathedrals where you could see stone on stone. This kind of weight of architecture revealing itself was really a big moment for him. And then there's the window, the real kind of only visual imagery in the building. That was done by a guy named Bronislaw Bach, who's an art instructor up at St. John's at this point, and done this kind of abstract version of the liturgical seasons, glass coming in from England, Germany, France, West Virginia as well. There was, though, a little bit of controversy about the window. Breuer had thought that his friend, Joseph Albers, who he'd been at the Bauhaus with, would design the window. And Albers had already done a little window in the private abbot's chapel up there. Bach was on site. He's starting to do some designing. And long story really short, they arrange a mini competition between Bach, and you know who won because you've seen the window completed already, and Albers. So Albers brings this into the mix. So that's a completely different sensibility, right, than that Bach window. And this is one of my monk friends who's photoshopped the window into the Abbey Church. And, they invite stained glass people in. They're talking to other experts in church art about this thing. And when it comes down to it, there's a vote taken, and it's like 7-5 in favor of keeping Bach working on the window. And Breuer went nuts, as he should have, really. This was architectural territory being stepped on. And again, they were able to work it out. But it was a moment where everybody kind of sat in their place and realized what they needed to do from that point out. So in the lower level of the church, there's a lot of stuff going on too. There's a shrine chapel here, a parish space, and then a lay brothers chapel. So lay brothers have professed to the Abbey, but they are saying their prayers in English, so they needed a separate space yet at this point. And then all around the perimeter here, where you see these numbers 9, there are 34 private individual chapels because, guess what? Celebration is still not a thing in the Catholic Church. So all of these priests that are there have to say Mass every day separately. But instead of giving them, the kind of makeshift space with the plumbing and the curtains and everything, they really have a huge artistic campaign to design chapels with different altars in them and also different art. So it's a big, huge project. And one of the things that I just have a chapter on in the book, but is just waiting to be really explored. St. Peregrine's Chapel. Here are these wall insets to show off the relics and peregrines down in here. The Lay Brothers Chapel, it's a trapezoid in plan. The trapezoid carries through in so many different ways in this building. This is what a typical altar or a typical chapel design look like. And this is the one, whenever I go on the road, which normally has a lot of St. John's people in the crowd, this is the chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Aquinas. Yes. Didn't get a big round of applause up at St. John's when I rolled out the book, I'll tell you that. But Dean Langan was with me, so we took the hit for everybody. But it's important because it shows kind of what was going on with this prototypical chapel design. And then the art is done by different people, and there's all these letters back and forth commissioning the art. And the artist who did this figure of St. Thomas Aquinas here was actually a New York Jewish artist of some great renown, Leonard Baskin. And when they wrote to Baskin to ask him to do it, he said, well, I would love to do it, but I'm afraid the New York art market has inflated my prices too much. But eventually they work it out. And the thing is that, again, like with the architect, they wanted to get the best artists to be involved in this project as well. So there we go, Breuer Church. Eventually he'll do the science building too, the library, dorms, monastic dorm tucked back here. This little ecumenical institute that some of you probably know is most like his domestic space. The gymnasium is done by his successor firm, but right here in front of the gym is his only public sculpture called The Athlete. So he designed it. The Goff guys cut it out of granite. Breuer signed it. It is the only piece of Marcel Breuer sculpture in the whole world, right up there, along with all these great buildings. So then he, at the same time, through Frank Kazmarczyk and Ted Hoffmeyer, actually, the construction head, is put in touch with the sisters up outside of Bismarck, North Dakota. And he designs for them their home and the University of Mary. And it's really kind of a lovely way to think about these two spaces. And I've done one paper on this kind of gendered relationship because they're at the same time and they're just different but the same as well. So this is on a bluff, Missouri River, tucked away back here, but the banner, chapel's a little bit smaller here, and then the monastic space. I mean, the whole site is smaller. But really beautiful, rubble granite on the outside. That use of that terracotta flue tile, and any good farm person from Minnesota knows that this is exactly what my dad was putting in the fields to drain them. And so this is at St. John's too, and those walkways. And this is this tie that modernism can do. You know, modernism is not all about just throwing out concrete without any ornament on it. These guys who work in it really well know how to tie it in to a regional identity, to think about it in really powerful ways. Interior of this chapel, see the windows here? They're actually concrete, and then there are chunks of glass in them. And it was designed by Breuer's office because of the little window problem at St. John's. Their note is very clear in the archives. It says, "We are doing the windows at Annunciation." It's very clear. And then he went and did a little parish church, in Muskegon, in Norton Shores. And I think this, for me, is actually his most fascinating building because that hyperbolic paraboloid, you know, when you hold a chain like this, that form is called a hyperbolic paraboloid. And it's in the banner at St. John's. But here he took that paraboloid and let it become, the banner became the church, really. It's not a big building, but when you stand on the side of this building, you feel like you are in constant motion. It's unbelievable. And they take really good care here, and Frank Kazmarczyk was involved, and there's a baptistry out front. And here's what the interior looks like, and it's deceiving where it looks like it's taller inside, it's actually shorter outside. I mean, so there's just like kind of this whole mental mind play that goes on with this church. So those are the churches that got built. He had a little run of being a church designer. He also did a few projects that never happened for this. Muskegon. Did a little convent for the sisters in Switzerland, Franciscans actually. A little different. This is different than what we've been looking at. There's the interior. And then that form of St. John's could also work for a synagogue. And it also was used for a design for Episcopalian chapel. So Breuer, for a while, was really thinking about sacred space through this work that had started in Collegeville. And Minnesota at the mid-century was a real hotbed of design, and particularly with sacred space, because there were a lot of enlightened patrons here willing to embrace modernism. So this is the church I was telling you about, Iliel and Eero Saarinen, right across the river in South Minneapolis, like on 34th and 32nd or something. If you haven't been in there, go in and see it sometime. And then over in St. Paul on LaFond Avenue, Barry Byrne, right? You've been to St. John's, did this church with the plan of a fish. So it's one of his fish churches, there's symbolism there, but concrete. And McGough, who built St. John's, built this church as well. There's the interior of it. And then Pietro Beluschi, who we saw as somebody who turned that competition down to start with, goes and finishes this church way up on the hill in Duluth. This is way up on top of the hill. And then Val Michelson goes over to Maplewood and does a little monastery, which is now the Harriet Tubman Center. And the sisters have designed a new building, have a new building over there. So he stays in town and has a long, successful career here. He does a prep school up at St. John's too. So there was a lot going on down at Gustavus. There was a lot going on architecturally with modern sacred space. I had a student who wrote on this some years back. This is over right on Lake Calhoun, so if you're ever over there, stop in and see that too. And synagogues. Everybody was exploring new ways to use these materials, but yet all with the same goal of providing a space that would facilitate worship, whatever it might be, in the most powerful way. And St. John's, I think, was a big reason that there is this mid-century explosion. Thank you. Would we like questions? Okay. Yes. So what have you been thinking about with sacred place? Just give me a couple of examples. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Was the termination? Uh-huh. Absolutely. Yeah, so I have to tell you a couple of things. Great question. The tabernacle was on the altar for a while after the church was completed, because the Lady Chapel that's off to one side that I showed you, there was a matching chapel on the other side of the space, but there was no entry into the nave proper from it. But that's where the tabernacle was moved then eventually, because it got too conflicting. And because it's a monastic church, there was a decision made to put the abbot's throne at the back, because part of that was to wrap that choir around the back, right? And like have that be a unified thing. But that was a really hierarchical moment that went away pretty quickly too. You know, and in fact, they really don't like to use that space or that chair, because they see it as this kind of pure hierarchy of the abbot being the all-encompassing abbot as opposed to being a member of that group. But I don't know, the sacred place thing's really interesting. They don't really talk about it that way. You know, they're thinking, I guess they think bigger picture of their whole campus as a sacred place, but it never ties back to this altar directly. I mean, that comes more out of discussions of sacred space. So I guess it could be too, just, you know, like who they were aligned with, who they were reading, you know, what kind of essays they were reading and things like that too. I mean, that happens, and you know, you can track exactly who they were following and things like that. So no, but I don't really have it here. But that's a really fascinating question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Exactly. You know, and it's you know, I don't know. Huh. Thanks, John.
Yeah. Let me